What's happening, people? Back with another reaction, back with some more Thomas Dolby, and we're returning to Astronauts and Heretics. Thank you once again to Stan, as well as to Mark, who's been commenting, and also to Kim and some others who commented on the predecessor track to the one we're about to listen to, which is to say, on the Golden Age of Wireless, I think it was 81, there was a track, Europa and the Pirate Twins, and a number of folks, I think Lori as well, commented that it wasn't a major hit in terms of the overall Billboard charting or any of the commercial sales, but it was a tune that was number one, popularized to some degree by MTV, and also that among Dolby fans specifically, it was a fan favorite. And that is a song that I remember Mark commenting in particular that it's about degrees of dynamism, the way some people can change and others don't, and thus over time some people get left behind. And of course, referring to Europa, it made me think maybe an individual story or a story that is representative of larger scale processes, and that came back to me when I came to this track, which is Eastern Bloc, which it lists on the Discogs master release that it's a sequel to Europa and the Pirate Twins, so there's a direct overt reference here. But of course, Eastern Bloc in a geopolitical sense, and given the time frame in which this album was released, it was still somewhat relevant, even if it was at the end of the Cold War. The idea of the group of countries that were led by, maybe dominated by, certainly best represented by the Soviet Union, and their conflict with, or contrast with, or opposition to Western countries, perhaps led most notably by the US and Western Europe. So yes, again, that might not be particularly relevant here, but when I see the phrase Eastern Bloc as a historian, I can't help but mention that. But yeah, so the Europa and the Pirate Twins tune had a very energetic, 80s synth pop feel to it, early 80s synth pop feel, so this is a decade plus later, and of course I wonder whether some evolved sonic stylings, which I've certainly heard on this album so far, meaning this album has done things that none of the material I heard from Dolby in the 80s did, or at least to that specific degree or in that particular flavor. So yes, I'm wondering how direct the connection will be lyrically and or sonically, so I'll just try to catch what I can. But this is a tune called Eastern Bloc, which is listed as a sequel to Europa and the Pirate Twins, which is from 1981, and this is from the 1992 album, Astronauts and Heretics.
once again in the freezing rain with the Eastern blood. And I used to think each time we kissed it was for real, but tonight I feel the wind has changed. Eastern blood, Eastern blood. Never gonna break that deadlock. Not gonna shake that green line. Shout, shout, tee it out, tee it in. Europa, Europa, shine across these white cameras, keep it loud and clear. Then Europa, Europa, coming, 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 coming to you. Are you seeing me?
What an incredible tune. So sonically, it's got a lot of the eccentricity that I've come to see as one of his main production characteristics, meaning his tunes really just don't sound like anyone else's tracks, even if you could put general labels on some of his songs that would fit with the material of other people, but in practice or in the details, there's just a really charismatic and unusual quality to his work, not in a bad way, but yeah, all these little percussive rhythms that are sort of evolving and changing over the course of the track. I don't think that's by accident. I think there's some conceptual meaning there, as well as some melodic flourishes that are unexpected or a bit wild, a bit dissonant. There was that one that really struck me because it almost sounded like a bit of a dissonant techno type of, wicked, bleepy, computerish type of melodic flourish. And also there's some wicked guitar work, some bluesy guitar work, a bit of harmonica by the end. So a lot going on in the tune and very dynamic sonically, including when it breaks into a very energetic and danceable type rhythm, which in some ways reminds me of Europa and the Pirate Twins, but with a different sound, a bit more 90s and a bit more natural instrument maybe than the 80s track that this is following up. But we do hear reference to Can We Be the Pirate Twins Again, and a reference to the Winds of Change, of course. And then what was it, like grabbing a crowbar, and I forget what the other tool was, and how the temple is at something that can change. So it feels like maybe this is in reference to the end, at least in part, to the end of the Cold War, and now that the Eastern Bloc has started to undergo some major shifts and the end of an earlier phase. How much can it change? How much can this be reflected in the process of moving on or being dynamic and not static and fixed? So again, maybe I'm reading too much into that, and again, there is this more immediate narrative that seems to be at least partially representative of larger scale forces and indeed change. But yeah, so we do get a direct callback to the previous song in the lyrical subject matter, but also maybe a reflection of what has changed since 81, now in 92. Some really cool vocals from Dolby, and ultimately I like the unpredictability of the track, which again, maybe there is some figurative expression in that very quality. But yeah, another really cool tune, and one that, as I said, just seems to be off in its own territory and in a styling that is very much Dolby's own. I wonder, given what people said about the Europa and the Pirate Twins tune, is this seen on the same level by notable Dolby fans? Is this seen as a really interesting follow-up chapter, or is this one maybe not as resonant? I do of course wonder about the commercial success. Is this one, did it hit with the same middling type of significance? I mean, not an obscure tune, but not a major hit at the same time. I do wonder. Either way, thank you again to Stan for the CD and all those who've commented on the Dolby reactions thus far. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Peace.